The Quiltmaker's Gift, from the perspective of the Quiltmaker, a retelling by Amber Ellingson Smith. The Quiltmaker lived high in the mountains. Even though she was older than the trees surrounding her home, her hands expertly made the most beautiful quilts in all the kingdom. She worked tirelessly to make her famous quilts. Many thought her quilts were made with magic and wished to buy them. The Quiltmaker had decided long ago to never sell her quilts for money. To those who came to her door and offered a king's ransom for her quilts, she would quietly turn them away. "I only give my quilts to those in need, the poor and homeless. I can see that you have no need for a quilt like mine." The guests that had frequented her door would argue, complain, coerce, and even cry, but the Quiltmaker would never sell her quilts to any who stopped by her humble cottage. On the coldest, most frigid night, the Quiltmaker filled her arms with her newest quilt, and with a warm heart she ventured down the mountain to one of the nearby villages. She found someone shivering and struggling to sleep in the snow, and wrapped them in her soft, warm quilt. Smiling, she returned home and began once again a new quilt. One day the Quiltmaker was startled to receive a knock at her door. She opened it to find a most unexpected guest. The king. He was the most ambitious of all the people who had come in search of one of her quilts. The king had everything he needed, and so much more. The Quiltmaker knew this, and would not give the king one of her quilts. In anger, the king demanded of her how he could obtain one of her quilts. Not scared by his overpowering command, the Quiltmaker responded with a quiet voice, while looking intently at the king. "I only give my quilts to those in need as gifts. If you will make gifts of all that you own, I will make you a quilt. With every gift you give, I will sew another patch to your quilt, and when all your possessions are gone, the quilt will be finished." This angered the king greatly, and he ordered his men to grab the newly finished quilt from the Quiltmaker. Frightened, but moving much quicker than anyone her age ever should, the Quiltmaker threw the quilt out the window. She sighed with relief as she watched the quilt float away in the breeze. The Quiltmaker watched the king's face boil with anger. She shivered in fear as the king ordered his men to chain her to a rock in the nearby cave of a bear. Despite her fear, she still denied the king one of her quilts. The Quiltmaker shivered through the night from fear of the bear waking and eating her. She thought hard all through the night. When the bear finally woke, she had a plan. The bear saw her in his cave and growled a ferocious growl that nearly knocked her over the very tired and frightened Quiltmaker. She held her ground and looked the bear in the eye, with a look only an old woman can give, and said, "My, what a grouchy bear you are! And it's no wonder! Look, you have nothing to sleep on but hard rocks. If you bring me an armful of pine needles, I will make you a soft pillow with my shawl." And that's just what happened. The bear was so surprised, for no one had ever shown him such kindness. The Quiltmaker's hands moved quickly, as they were used to doing. The bear watched in amazement. When the pillow was finished, he returned the favor by freeing the Quiltmaker from her bonds, and then he shared with her his breakfast of berries and honey. To her surprise, the Quiltmaker saw the king riding up the hill. When he saw her eating with the bear, he was livid. The Quiltmaker was frightened once again. This time the king ordered the Quiltmaker to the smallest island. It was so small that she could barely stand on it on her tiptoes. She stood there all day, and her feet and legs ached beyond all belief. Suddenly a sparrow flew by. The poor animal looked exhausted, and the Quiltmaker called for the bird to rest on her shoulder before it continued on its journey. The poor bird was shivering from the cold. The Quiltmaker lovingly made a coat for him from the scraps of her vest. When the bird was well rested, he flew off very grateful for all the Quiltmaker had done for her. Alone once more, the Quiltmaker was reminded of her aching feet. Suddenly, she heard a rush of wings. She looked up to see a huge cloud of sparrows flying toward her. They picked her up with their little beaks and carried her to the shore. After setting her in a nearby tree, she began making little coats for each and every one of the birds to express her gratitude. This time, the Quiltmaker was not so surprised to see the king riding towards the shore. However, it was evident from the expression on the king's face that he was surprised to see the quiltmaker perched in a tree, surrounded by birds in purple coats. With a defeated countenance, the king begged the old woman to make him a quilt. He claimed again that it was the only thing that would make him truly happy. The wise old quiltmaker just shook her head. Trying to help the king understand, she repeated her offer. The king cried, for he loved his beautiful things. With great wisdom, the quiltmaker responded to the king's sobs. "What good are all your things if they do not make you happy?" The king thought long and hard about this. The quiltmaker was exhausted from all the adventures of the last 2 days, and slept all the while the king thought. Finally, the king consented to give away his treasures. The quiltmaker shook her head at the king's dejected look. He did not understand, but he soon would. The king went to his castle, and the quiltmaker returned to her cottage in the mountains. Slowly, very slowly, she began to sew a quilt for the king. As time passed, she began working more furiously. The king sent her a bird each time he gave away one of his treasures. The king had begun giving away his treasures at a breathless pace, and the quiltmaker was swarmed constantly by new birds. With each gift he gave away, she added another piece to the quilt. Her swift, confident hands were able to keep up with the pace of the king, but only just. As she worked, she smiled. She knew exactly what was happening to the king. He would never be the same person again. The quilt grew more and more beautiful with each gift that the king gave away. At the same time, the king grew more and more happy with each gift he gave. Finally, the king had given away all his treasures. The quiltmaker finished the last stitch in the king's magnificent quilt. Like she had so many times before, the quiltmaker started her journey down the mountain to find the king and present him with his quilt. After a very long search, she found him. His robes had turned to rags. The king's dejected face had turned to delight. His eyes glittered as he told the quiltmaker about his journeys around the world, giving to those in need. The quiltmaker smiled. The king had learned the greatest lesson any person could learn. From her bag she pulled out the quilt she had labored over for so many hours, and wrapped the king in its warm embrace. Her heart glowed as warm as the king's face was bright. Quizzically, the king asked her what that was for. She responded with a warm voice. "I promised you that when you gave away all that you had, when you were poor as so many others are, only then would I give you one of my quilts." The king looked up at the kind old quiltmaker. "I am not poor. I may look it, but my heart is full of joy and happiness. I am, in truth, the richest man alive." The quiltmaker smiled. Her heart was warmed by the king's expressions of joy. "Yes, perhaps you are, but as promised, I have made you this quilt." "Thank you," replied the king, "but I have one last gift to give." The quiltmaker followed the ragged king to his tattered wagon. "I have saved this gift just for you." The quiltmaker gasped as she held her hand to her mouth, as the king pulled from his wagon the padded throne that once sat in his palace. "This is just the thing for you," he explained. "It is very comfortable, and you will rest easy during your long days of sewing." The quiltmaker held back her tears of joy, but just barely. Her tears were not for the gift she had received, but for the change that was wrought in the good king. He was never greedy again. He never required his subjects to give him gifts. Rather, he helped the old quiltmaker by distributing her quilts to those who needed them most. The old quiltmaker was truly happy, for she had helped the king find the true joy of giving. There was never more generous king before or after, and the people were never so blessed.